Hey there, friends. David Lightbringer here, and our tour of the most magical and mysterious places in Westeros has finally reached Hardhome, as you knew it eventually would. That's right. Just like a weary, malnourished refugee army of several thousand wildlings were straggling into Hardhome. No, that's not the vibe. It's not the vibe. We're exploding into the Hardhome mystery with enthusiasm and vigor, like Mount St. Helens blowing the side of its mountain face off. Or perhaps we're stalking Hardhome, the Hardhome mystery, menacingly from the cliff face, like the four horsemen of the icy apocalypse, and stealing in under cover of snow and long night. However you choose your approach, be careful of the screaming caves. I think that's the main thing. They've been screaming for about 600 years, and oh, what's this? A letter's just in with an update from Cotter Pike on how things are going at Hardhome. At Hardhome, with 6 ships, wild seas, Blackbird lost with all hands, 2 Lyseni ships driven aground on Skane, Talon taking water. Very bad here. Wildlings eating their own dead things in the woods. Bravosi captains will only take women, children on their ships. Witch women call us slavers. Attempt to take Stormcrow defeated. 6 crew dead, many wildlings. 8 ravens left, dead things in the water. Send help by land, seas racked by storms. From Talon, by hand of Maester Harmoon. There's the lines you were looking for. Dead things in the wood, dead things in the water, and only the screaming caves for shelter. Sounds very bad there, indeed. Sounds like they could use a bit of a rescue. But even worse than the current situation at Hardhome is what happened at Hardhome 600 years ago. Of course, the night the whole area and town exploded in a giant conflagration that was seen from the wall. Sounds like a job for disaster hunters, naturally. So what happened here? Just what happened? Is this a forerunner for the Doom? A trial run, as they say? Was it an inside job by the Faceless Men or the Maesters or someone else? Or was it a natural cataclysm? And if so, what kind? Meteor, volcano, gas explosion? And then we have questions like, why are the caves screaming? What are the dead things in the water? And what's going to happen there in Winds of Winter to make this situation even worse? Because you know that's how Winds of Winter is going to go down. And speaking of Winds of Winter, I've actually got a brand new Arya Winds of Winter prediction that I've never thought of before. Just thought of it today, actually. And I'm here a few days later to say that those Winds of Winter Arya predictions will be coming in a new video next week. It'll be called Arya's Return. It'll look like this, so do watch out for it. But yeah, I got cooking. I ran a little long. Semantics, really. But it didn't make sense to put a 20-minute Winds predictions video on the end of what is already a 30-minute Hardhome video. So enjoy half an hour of straight lore and mystery exploration, and then next week I'll have some Winds predictions and more mystery exploration. And thanks again for watching and supporting. Yes, it's the long-awaited Hardhome Disaster Hunters video. First section, the explosion, aka what caused the explosion. The Hardhome disaster is summed up very well by Jon Snow in his inner monologue in A Dance with Dragons, so we'll just go ahead and read that. Jon and first builder Othel Yarwick, who's named after Othello for some reason which totally escapes me, are discussing the wildlings who have fled the battle at the wall to Hardhome under the leadership of Mother Mole. And Othel asks Jon if he knows the tale of Hardhome. He did. Hardhome had been halfway toward becoming a town, the only true town north of the wall, until the night 600 years ago when hell had swallowed it. Its people had been carried off into slavery or slaughtered for meat, depending on which version of the tale you believed. Their homes and halls consumed in a conflagration that burned so hot that watchers on the wall far to the south had thought the sun was rising in the north. Afterward, ashes rained down on the haunted forest and shivering sea alike for almost half a year. Traders reported finding only nightmarish devastation where Hardhome had stood, a landscape of charred trees and burned bones, waters choked with swollen corpses, blood-chilling shrieks echoing from the cave mouths that pocked the great cliff that loomed above the settlement. 6 centuries had come and gone since that night, but Hardhome was still shunned. The wild had reclaimed the site, Jon had been told, but rangers claimed that the overgrown ruins were haunted by ghouls and demons and burning ghosts with an unhealthy taste for blood. It's not the sort of refuge I'd choose either, Jon said, but Mother Mole was heard to preach that the free folk would find salvation where once they found damnation. So we'll get to exactly how Mother Mole's vision was both very right and very wrong later in the video. But in the name of giving the people, that's you, what they want, that's what you want, let's talk about the big kablooey first. And the first thing that we can say is that this was not merely a huge fire, but some kind of volcanism. If it had been one huge fire, then the ash would have entered the jet stream, rained down for a couple weeks, and some of it would have spread to far-flung locations. But it would have thinned out as it did so, and it would have dissipated fairly soon. Instead, the ash continues to rain down in the local area for 6 months or so. That necessitates that there's got to be a continual source, throwing burning ash up into the air, and really the only thing that can explain that would be some sort of volcanic activity. And this also rules out a meteor. Sad to say, I love meteors, but one single impact would only produce one smoke event, and there wouldn't be continual ash raining down for 6 months. So, same logic there. Hardhome is actually a really good place to find a volcano. It's on the tip of a peninsula that's along the coastline of a major continent. It reminds me a lot of the Kamchatka Peninsula or the Aleutian Island chain, both of which are along the Pacific Ring of Fire and are heavily volcanic. We know that there are natural obsidian deposits in the north because the Children of the Forest used to supply the Night's Watch with obsidian, so that implies there is volcanism somewhere north of the wall. And this again would compare well to Alaska, where there are both active and dormant volcanoes and lots of tasty obsidian deposits. Famously, there is geothermal activity just south of the wall at Winterfell, where they've got all the hot springs. And looking at Long Lake on the map, it may even be a rift lake, kind of like Siberia's Lake Baikal. Now, although there's not an obvious volcanic mont at Hardhome, it's very possible that it may have blown itself into the bay. The caldera itself could be in the bay, or it could be that the cliff face is what's left of the side of the mountain. Unfortunately, we don't have accurate maps from 600 years ago to compare the exact landscape, so it's hard to say what exactly it looked like before this apocalyptic event, which I think is an eruption. And just speculating a bit, it could be that fertile volcanic soil in the area is part of what drew the wildlings to the area to try to make their first town. Other reasons given for making a town there are the deep water harbor, so trading ships can stop there, and that would bring the wildlings a little more tightly into the international web of trade, because right now they pretty much only trade illicitly with the Night's Watch brothers. And then there's also a lot of timber in that area, again, potentially fertile soil, and lots of happy fish and seals and sea lions and sea mammals of all kinds. Presumably lots of crabs, because they used to worship crab gods here. More on that in a moment. Dead things in the water. All right, time for a little Hardhome origins trivia. So there is a peninsula on the Isle of Skye in northern Scotland that has a very famous rock formation known as the Store. And at the Store, the most famous individual formation is known as the Old Man of the Store. Hardhome is at Storold's Point. Store Old. Old Man of the Store. Store Old. Yeah. And if you look on the map, you can see that the Isle of Skye is roughly in an equivalent location to Hardhome if you compare the British Isles and Westeros. It's just on the west coast instead of the east coast. As you can see, the Store is a giant cliff face, just like Hardhome is described, and it's the result of ancient landslides, which could be potentially a clue that George is thinking about landslides or volcanic-based landslide at Hardhome, even though the Store itself is not volcanic, just to be clear. And finally, the area right at the base of the Store is called the Sanctuary, and of course, the wildlings are taking sanctuary at Hardhome. Next up, the Screaming Caves. So the other big clue about what's going on here geologically are these Screaming Caves. The Black Brothers occasionally sail by Hardhome, and they still call the caves the Screaming Caves to this day. So it appears to be an ongoing phenomenon and not just, foolish talk. It could be that the explanation is magical. At Harrenhal, where Aegon burned a whole lot of people one night, there are also said to be burning fiery ghosts. So if a lot of people burned here, we don't know how ghosts work in Ice and Fire, but maybe there are ghosts. However, I think there's a much better explanation for the screaming sound, and that would, of course, be a leak, a gas leak of CO2 or methane. So think of the sound of a boiling tea kettle, but somewhere way back in the caves, maybe more than one, and that sound is echoing all through the hollow cliff face, all through the cave system, and that is your screaming sound. If you look up screaming sound in caves, this is the first explanation that you will find. And of course, highly pressurized pockets of gas in the rock are a big hazard for miners. And there's a whole YouTube deep dive you can do about mining accidents if you want to. They're kind of fascinating. But the point is, this could be how the Hardhome disaster got started, with a pocket of gas being ignited and exploding. Volcanic activity can trigger such gas explosions, and I suppose if the gas explosion was big enough, it could even trigger a certain amount of volcanic activity. If, for example, the explosion was big enough to collapse a swelling caldera. You know how George is always trying to find the Balrog in different places in his story, so the description of a landscape of charred trees and burned bones makes sense. There seems to have been an explosion and then a lot of fire beyond whatever pyroclastic flow may have occurred. Although when they talk about the entire village being burned, it could be that it was smothered in pyroclastic flow or exploded from underneath. Any of those things could be true because no one that was there to witness it survived. So all these accounts are coming after the fact. The description of the waters being choked with swollen corpses would be people who jumped into the water and drowned in an attempt to flee from the fire, as well as people who suffocated to death on all the gas, smoke, and ash. Now, the caves at Hardhome could still be on fire, and that's how our incredible Hardhome artist Juan Barquet has depicted it, as you can see. There are, in fact, methane leaks that can burn for decades, such as the Centralia mine fire in Pennsylvania. Shout out Grey Waste Tim, who's from Pennsylvania. He knew just what this was. And basically, it's an abandoned mine which caught on fire because there's a gas leak, and it's burned since 1962 and is expected to burn for potentially another 200 or 250 years. So the sailors that sail by do not describe the caves as being on fire, but there is this Melisandre vision of Hardhome. Snowflakes swirled from a dark sky and ashes rose to meet them, the gray and the white whirling around each other as flaming arrows arced above a wooden wall, and dead things shambled silently through the cold, beneath a great gray cliff where fires burned inside 100 caves. The wind rose and the white mist came sweeping in, impossibly cold, and one by one the fires went out. Afterward, only the skulls remained. So this actually sounds like it might have been part of the inspiration for the Hardhome episode of Game of Thrones, which of course was one of the best episodes on the entire series. It really gave us a good feel for what it would be like to be under a white attack. It was truly terrifying. The fires Melisandre sees in the caves clearly on some level represent the lives of the people there, since we see them being snuffed out as the white cold moves in and then only the skulls remain. However, the gas leak really is the best explanation for the screaming sound. I've thought about this for years, and that means that there could be somewhere back there an ever-burning fire, and maybe that's part of what Mel is seeing in the vision. Such fires could actually be good protection against the whites and the others if you could get on the other side of the line of fire. But that's you're pretty down to it at that point, so hopefully it doesn't come to that. Now, the worst scenario would be wildlings lighting campfires in the caves, which is a very logical thing to do, and somehow igniting the gas and creating a new Hardhome explosion. Maybe that's preferable to all of your people being whited in the army of the dead, but yeah, it's not really a good plan. But you could definitely see how that could happen by accident. And that would really give Cotter Pike something to complain to Jon about if he's around to write one of his signature cheerful letters. One of the biggest questions that everyone asks about Hardhome, because it's a very logical question to ask, is this related to the Doom of Valyria? The Doom is the only thing comparable to Hardhome. It was a huge volcanic explosion, lingering curses, and the Hardhome disaster took place 200 years before the Doom of Valyria, so not that far apart in time, and definitely close enough for people to try to make a connection. Now, it seems pretty certain that first and foremost, the Doom was caused by the fact that Valyrian fire mages had been banking the fires of the 14 flames, as it is said, for about 5,000 years, which just means using fire magic sorcery to keep the volcanoes at a nice equilibrium so they don't erupt and ruin all their fancy cities. So the Doom of Valyria essentially were those fire mages losing control of that equilibrium, and all the pent-up tension, if you will, was released. And it is strongly suggested that the Faceless Men were the ones who assassinated a bunch of Valyrian fire mages so that this losing of control occurred. So it doesn't seem very likely that this is what was going on at Hardhome. The wildlings weren't banking the fires of the Hardhome screaming caves, I don't think. It seems, by all accounts, to have been a normalish town until it blew up. And there was actually a maester who traveled there and lived there for 3 years and wrote a book, which we'll talk about. However, it's still a volcanic explosion, so people are still wondering, was it somehow a trial run for the Doom? Meaning, did someone mean to set off the explosion, by igniting the caves? Was this terrorism? So like I said, the Faceless Men are the ones who we know pulled off the Doom, and they claim to have formed in the slave mines of Valyria before the founding of Braavos. Now, Braavos was founded in secret and remained secret for 111 years until an event called the Unmasking. And Valyria was still around at the time of the Unmasking, which means Braavos was founded at least 111 years before the Doom, and probably a little more than that. Ergo, it's very possible that the Faceless Men did exist at the time of the Hardhome disaster. But I really have to say that this does not sound like their MO. To kill hundreds and probably several thousand innocent wildlings, including women and children, just to test out a giant weapon technology. And I guess there were innocent Valyrians that died in the Doom, and the Faceless Men did that. But the wildlings never did anything to the Faceless Men at all, unlike the Valyrians who enslaved them, obviously, and destroyed the cultures that their people were from. So I'm a little skeptical that the Faceless Men did that as a trial run for the Doom. Also, 200 years apart. Why would you do a trial run and then wait 2 centuries to pull it off? It doesn't really make sense. And it's unlikely that anyone hired them to do that, because I don't think they were around yet, publicly known to be hired. Braavos' location actually remained secret for a couple hundred years after the Unmasking. So yeah, they probably weren't hired to do this. So here's an alternate idea that I came up with while writing the script for this. So perhaps these tales of Hardhome's people being carried off into slavery 600 years ago have some sort of historical precedent. It probably didn't happen at the same time as the explosion. That doesn't really make sense. But perhaps wildlings were occasionally, at times, carried off by slavers. So maybe wildlings that had heard about the Hardhome disaster, or had lost relatives in it, let's say, ended up somewhere in the Valyrian slave mines, and maybe the idea for the Doom began with knowledge of the Hardhome disaster. It's a little far-fetched, but yeah, maybe one of the first Faceless Men was a wildling who was like, hey, you know what? We might be able to get these mountains to blow up. So what about other Doom collaborators having been involved? My theory about the Doom is that it was Aenar Targaryen working with the Faceless Men to bring about the Doom. Aenar the abolitionist, as I call him. And check out Dreams Come from Dragons, and the Doom was an inside job for more on that story. But at the time of Hardhome, the Targaryens weren't on Dragonstone yet. In fact, the first Valyrians were just founding Dragonstone at that time. So not Targaryens, but different Valyrians. And so yeah, I don't think Aenar Targaryen's ancestors were thinking about the Doom at this point. Now, the fact that the Valyrians were just moving into the Narrow Sea around this time is potentially interesting. Some people have wondered maybe dragons attacked Hardhome, lots of fire, set off the cave explosion, and that could theoretically be possible and be tied to legends of slaves being taken away. However, I really think dragons attacking Hardhome is a tale that would have been carried. It seems to me that there would have been witnesses to the dragons flying and the Valyrians moving that way somewhere, or records of it in the Valyrian history. And as many of you will probably know, the Maesters of the Citadel often went to Valyria to examine their historical records. So I rate the possibility of a Valyrian dragon attack on Hardhome as one of the lower ranking explanations. But the timing is interesting. Dragonstone was founded right around the time of the Hardhome disaster. So let me know in the comments if you think that's the answer. Now, the other suspected Doom collaborator with the Faceless Men would be the Citadel, the Maesters of the Citadel. And like I said, there was a Maester who visited Hardhome. And this story is a little bit fishy, so we'll talk about that in a section or two. But first, I have one more idea about how the Valyrians and the Doom could be tied to Hardhome. And that other potential parallel to the Doom would be dragon bomb theory, of course. It's the theory that dragons' eggs are explosive, like bombs. The main clue about this is that this seems to be what happened at Summerhall. I made a whole video about this, what really happened at Summerhall. Thanks for watching. And as you'll recall, King Egg on the 5th, tried to hatch 7 dragon's eggs with the aid of wildfire and perhaps other sorcery. The pyromancers, the alchemists of the Pyromancers Guild, they are usually very good at controlling wildfire and understanding its potency, and yet the explosion and the blaze there was just way out of control, way more than they expected. So the explanation for that could be the 7 dragon's eggs. Dany's eggs are kind of exploding in the pyre when they're producing dragons. So I said, what happens to all the magical energy that produces dragons if the dragon's eggs don't hatch into dragons, so they just explode? Maybe that energy becomes a bomb, and this would explain what we see at Summerhall. So if dragon's eggs are explosive, then Think about the Valyrian Peninsula. It would have been packed with dragon's eggs, all the dragons roosting in the various caves. So it could have been that those dragon's eggs exploding amplified the doom, or more likely, it could be that the faceless men, not only did they kill the mages, but they may have set off some of those dragon bombs, per se, and really gotten the thing started. So you can see where this is going. Were there dragon's eggs perhaps stuffed into the caves at Hardhome somehow? Well, in a word, yes. And in more words, dragons did used to live in Westeros, wild apparently, and all through the world. But there were dragons in Westeros once, long before the Targaryens came, as our own legends and histories tell us. If dragons did first spring from the 14 flames, they must have been spread across much of the known world before they were tamed. And, in fact, there is evidence for this, as dragon bones have been found as far north as Ib, and even in the jungles of Sothorios. So, in my theory headcanon, dragons were actually first created in ancient Ashai before Valyria ever arose, as the ancient Ashai records claim. And this is something that Septon Barth mentions as a potential origin for dragons. Those ancient Ashai dragon lords would, again, in my theory headcanon, be the Great Empire of the Dawn. And whatever you call them, I do think they came to Westeros in the Dawn Age and did some Azor Ahai Long Night stuff. This would be where the sword Dawn came from, Dragonsteel of the Last Hero, the idea that Azor Ahai is connected to Westeros and the Long Night and the others at all. That's that theory. But the thing is, those would have been dragon lords riding dragons, kind of like Valyrians. And the Maesters seem to be talking about evidence of wild dragons in random places like Sothorios and Ib. And you'll remember that Dany also finds a dragon skeleton in the middle of the Red Waste, which is pretty far from Valyria. So apparently wherever dragons were created, Ashai or Valyria, some of them seem to have roamed wild. And of course, even on Dragonstone, there are the wild, untamed dragons. That's a big plot point in House of the Dragon. And then in that quote a minute ago that we just read, the Maesters referred to legends and histories, of course, and those would be the legends of Westerosi dragon slayers. There's two in the south, Davos Dragonslayer and Serwyn of the Mirror Shield. But then there's also Galadon of Morn on Tarth, which is on the east coast in the Narrow Sea. And then a little farther north in the Eyrie, the Maesters actually think that part of the legend of the Winged Knight riding a falcon could be ancient sightings of dragon riders. Sothorios certainly makes sense as a place dragons could get comfortable. There's probably some volcanoes down there in the green hell or whatever. And just think about how fancy the Sothorios dragon's going to be, making all the wyverns jealous. How'd you learn how to breathe fire, man? Well, it's this really a process actually called Dracomorph. You don't want to know. And then as for the Isle of Ib, well, this is actually really interesting. The Isle of Ib having dragon skeletons. Our beloved author, George Martin, has apparently compared the size of Ib to Iceland, which is at an equivalent northern latitude. And Iceland, of course, is a volcanic island. And then over on Ib, we find that there are gold deposits in the mountains, and gold is pretty much only brought to the surface by magmatic activity, which implies that Ib used to be volcanic sometime in the ancient past, perhaps when dragons, wild dragons, were roosting there and getting cozy. And we see a similar logic at play in Ashai, where dragons may originate. Again, there's also gold that is found in the hills of Ashai. So that's a clue that that's a volcanic Hell Valley of Stygian there. You knew it had to be with a name like Stygian. It's got to be a Stygian hellscape. So it is. It's likely volcanic. But we're talking about Hardhome. So could dragons have once roosted at Hardhome and left some eggs in the caves? That's the question. It does seem possible. It does seem possible. If a dragon flew west from Ib, they might land at Hardhome. And there are other clues about dragons having been in the north of Westeros, namely the fake Horn of Jormungand that Mance produces at the Wall, the one that looks almost exactly like Euron's Valyrian Dragonbinder horn. Mance Rayder supposedly found this horn in a giant's grave in the Frostfangs, and it was so big and impressive he got the notion to tell Jon that it was the Horn of Jormungand. But again, and I'll put these descriptions back up on the screen, you can see Mance's fake Horn of Jormungand is described almost exactly like the Valyrian Dragonbinder horn. So how did some ancient giant in the north, or ancient wildling perhaps, gain access to a dragon horn to turn it into a dragon horn? It does very much come across like a dragon horn that would have been made by ancient first men. It's got the same rough magical technology of using sacred metals and runes and glyphs to bind the horn. One assumes that's got something to do with the magic, but instead of Valyrian steel and Valyrian glyphs, it's ancient gold of the first men and runes of the first men. So same exact idea, same exact size and color and looking horn, but this apparently was made by the first men. So Where did they get a dragon horn from? Perhaps there were ancient dragons roosting at Hardhome. That would be the only place up here that they would, again, feel cozy. So maybe this giant with a dragon horn in his grave, maybe he's the old man of Storald's Point. It's a giant with a dragon horn. And then I guess I skipped one of my favorite clues about the Horn of Joramun being a dragon horn, at least Mance's Horn of Joramun, is the fact that the name Joramun seems taken from Norse Jormungandr, who is the world serpent. You guys know Jormungandr, and you guys probably also know that in Norse mythology, dragons and serpents are essentially the same thing. Jormungandr is tied to Ragnarok, and the Horn of Joramun is tied to the fall of the wall, which is basically Ragnarok. So yeah, this could be a whole thing. I am going to do some Horn of Winter, Horn of Joramun videos coming up soon, but that's a little preview. And yeah, that very well could be a dragon horn, an ancient dragon horn of the first men that Melisandre tried to burn. But I don't think it burned. I think it's still around. I'll make a video. So were there dragon's eggs, explosive dragon's eggs, involved at Hardhome? I do want to say that they don't really need to have been there. Just the gas and the volcano could explain everything that we see. However, if there was a mining disaster type scenario where there's a pocket of pressurized gas that's behind a rock wall that's suddenly released and caught on fire, a dragon's egg could make sense as an igniter, essentially. And then dragon's eggs could be even more important if this was a terrorism situation, an inside job, if someone was trying to ignite this volcano or cliff face. This is one of the dead ends that people come to when they say, oh, we're the Faceless Men trying to test out the technology for the Doom. It's like, well, without Valyrian fire mages banking the fires, the mechanism is gone. However, if dragon's eggs were used to set off the Doom, then perhaps you could have someone testing out that technology at Hardhome. Or it could just be a similar dragon's egg, dragon bomb related disaster. All right, it's time for another Maester conspiracy, because why not? Why not one more? I mean, this quote in The World of Ice and Fire is very, very suggestive. This fella, Maester Willis, lived at Hardhome for 3 years and wrote a book about it, and, well, here's the story. Willis journeyed to Hardhome on a Pentoshi trader and established himself there as a healer and counselor so that he might write of their customs. He was given the protection of Gorm the Wolf, a chieftain who shared control of Hardhome with 3 other chiefs. When Gorm was murdered in a drunken brawl, however, Willis found himself in mortal danger and made his way back to Old Town. There he set down his account, only to vanish the year after the illuminations were done. It was said in the Citadel that he was last seen at the docks, looking for a ship that would take him to Eastwatch by the sea. So we have no idea when this happened at all. Conspicuously, the Maesters don't tell us in their book, The World of Ice and Fire, which is supposedly in the universe a book of history that's meant for semi-public consumption. So maybe they omitted the fact that Maester Willis went back to Hardhome right before it blew up on purpose because it was a conspiracy. I mean, it is kind of fishy how he stayed there for 3 years, went back to Old Town, wrote down everything he knew, consulted with the Citadel for about a year, and then hustled right on back. So there's really only 2 plausible explanations that I can think of here. Hate to use reductive reasoning, but he didn't go back to Hardhome for the weather or the food or the lifestyle. So either he had a very hot wildling girlfriend, we're talking Val level hot, or maybe just a wildling wife and a kid. And of course, Maesters of the Citadel are forbidden to have such. So maybe he wanted to get back to his secret family and forsake his, because he never turned up. He was never seen again. So that's one reason. He had a wildling family or just a wildling hottie that he had to get back to, or else he went back there to blow it up like a secret agent. I really don't know why else he would go back there. As the passage said, when he left, he was on the run for his life. Gorm the Wolf died. That was his homie. That was his Squirrel Master, if you will. Squirrel Master sounds like it could be a wildling chieftain name. But if this is the case, then this is some chilling stuff. I mean, first of all, Willis, he's a real hardcore secret agent. I mean, he went there and lived for 3 years and then went back to Old Town and then went back by himself and somehow set off this explosion. That's pretty crazy. Although maybe he didn't go by himself. Again, the Maesters are the ones writing all this history. This is always the problem with Maester conspiracies. But yeah, maybe Willis is a hardcore MFer acting on behalf of a secret faction within the Citadel that was threatened by the idea of the wildlings organizing and forming a town, because that could very well lead to the wildlings forming a standing army and just becoming more of a threat to invade Westeros. So perhaps the Maesters were snuffing it out. That's pretty monstrous, but it's certainly no more monstrous than Check's notes. Many things that have happened in world history. So I leave that with you. Let me know if that's the option you prefer, the Citadel conspiracy angle. You do have to wonder why this whole story is even in there. And it does kind of sound like a cover story. Oh yeah, he went there to learn the customs, and then he left when Gorm the Wolf died, and then he went back and was never seen again. And we don't know when this happened. That was pouring like an avalanche coming down the mountain. Yeah, it's a banger. It's a banger. Anyways, thanks for watching, guys. I did have fun making this one. And once again, watch out next week. Arya's Return, Winds of Winter Predictions. That'll be out Wednesday. So, cheers. Thank you so much for supporting me. And I'll see you soon.